podcast. I'm so excited to be back. I say welcome back because we've been on hiatus for a little bit and for very good reasons. So we've taken the winter months and we completely retooled our Rise to Reign method of life transformation and made it way more accessible to pretty much everybody. So we're super excited about that. It's actually open right now for enrollment if you want to see about it and see if it's right for you, if you need some healing in your life and you want to go deeper around the concepts that we talk about in the Rise to Reign podcast, go to risetoreign.com/enroll and you can read all about the Rise to Reign framework. We're having it's open for enrollment for just a brief period of time. So go ahead and jump on that. Don't wait because we're getting ready to close it for our next cohort going through. All right. So without any further ado, today we are talking about emotional addiction. And in the last podcast episode, we wrapped up a 3-part series on emotional healing via emotional intelligence. So just to give everybody kind of a reorientation to where we're at, the Rise to Reign framework is 7 principles applied to 7 categories of living. And the principles are identity, sovereignty, integrity, amnesty, polarity, vulnerability, and generosity. So wanted to make sure that I got them exactly right. We covered all 7 principles at the beginning of season 2 of the Rise to Reign podcast. It goes back to June of 21. And then we apply those 7 principles to 7 categories. Body, soul, which is the complex of the mind, will, and emotions, spirit, relationships, finances, creativity, and calling. And so that's why we call it the method of life transformation, because we take those healing principles and we apply them to every category of our life in which we need healing. So we just wrapped up, back in November, we wrapped up a series on emotional intelligence. So I am just kind of picking up where I left off there. And today we're talking about emotional addiction. So what the heck is emotional addiction? Well, emotional addiction happens in our central nervous system, and it's basically what our system is used to. Our nervous system is patterned in a way, starting in childhood, actually before you're born, all the way through childhood, and then every experience in your life has been recorded in your central nervous system. And whatever emotions that you are used to hanging out in become addictive. And so as we know, like with a heroin addiction maybe, people who are addicted don't necessarily feel pleasure from their addiction, but they need it to feel okay. Their body gets to a point where you have to have that hit to feel normal. I guess normal is not a great word because in emotional addiction, it's far from normal. Your normal is righteousness, which is a state of alignment, right relationship with God, right relationship with yourself, right relationship with others. Peace, which is a calm sense, and also the Hebrew version of peace is nothing missing, nothing broken. And joy, which is a sense of calm delight. So that being said, righteousness, peace, and joy is your normal. That should be your emotional homeostasis. But I would venture to say most, if not all of us, that's not the case for us because we have grown up in this incredibly traumatic world and faced so much turbulence and so much chaos and so much hurt, and some of us more than others, but we all have that stuff in our nervous system that patterns our nervous system to something other than righteousness, peace, and joy, and that's your emotional addiction. So an emotional addiction is kind of, it could be referred to as emotional equilibrium or emotional homeostasis, and that's pretty much like where you hang out emotionally, where you feel comfortable. Now, is overwhelming anxiety and fear comfortable? No, it's far from comfortable, but it's what you're used to. It's familiar. So remember, to your brain, familiarity equals safety. And so many of us have safety linked up with anger, or we have safety linked up with fear and controlling type behaviors because that is what is erroneously patterned into our central nervous system, and we become addicted to the chemicals. Emotions have a chemical representation in our body, and our body physically becomes addicted to the chemicals that are represented or accompanied by the emotions that we feel. So it's a emotional addiction, like I said, could be called emotional homeostasis or emotional equilibrium. I don't like to use homeostasis and equilibrium too much because those words actually imply balance, and it's anything but balanced. In an emotional addiction, it's not balanced, it's out of balance. So it's basically where you hang out, where you feel comfortable, where you feel safe. And so let's establish an accurate baseline for where you hang out emotionally. That's important. This is the default where you feel most comfortable, and we'll call it emotional addiction. So your clean slate when you're born or when you're in utero is programmed not unlike a computer. So you come into this world tabula rasa, which is what Freud called it, and that's Latin for a clean slate. Well, we know now that's not necessarily the case. Often we come in with generational trauma and wounds that we're carrying, and then there's things that happen even in utero that begin this programming process. So we're not a perfectly clean slate, but let's say that, when a baby's born, it's pretty much a blank slate, that like a computer that needs to be programmed. So the experiences in early childhood accomplish much of this programming. From about in utero to about the age 7, your personality is fully formed. Your computer is pretty much programmed. Now there's some adjustments to the software that happen over your life and the programming continues, but the base software of your central nervous system is pretty much established by age 7. So the problem here is that young children don't have a grid of understanding. So deep fear and shame often are entrained very easily into a young child's nervous system with very little obvious stimulus. So a lot of times we look back on our lives and we think, oh, that wasn't so bad. It wasn't that big of a deal. But your programming is based on your perception at the time that the event happens. So what that means is that however you perceive the event as being scary or betrayal or whatever you perceived it as, that's how it got laid down in your central nervous system, and that's how it has to be healed. And we'll get to that later. But as the computer is being programmed metaphorically, the brain is searching for meanings and definitions so it can form responses. So it goes like this: stimulus, definition, and then response. That's the cycle. Stimulus, definition, and then response. And that cycle, the stimulus, definition, response cycle, forms what's called a neurotransmitter. And neurotransmitters are basically just a message that it's like a messenger that forms connections in our brain. And that's how we learn, basically. So neurotransmitters trigger chemicals that we experience as emotional sensations. This is all science. Like, for the longest time, we've thought of emotions as like woo-woo and out there and not important, but they're actually physical things that can be measured with instruments. And so when we have the stimulus, definition, response cycle, we form a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter triggers chemicals to be released, and we experience that as emotional sensation. So the emotional state, the chemical reality that we experience most frequently in childhood, forms the basis of our emotional addiction or emotional equilibrium or emotional homeostasis. So if you were afraid much of your childhood, that's how your nervous system is patterned, and that's where you go. Now, anger can be secondary to fear, because as we get older and we want to be more powerful, a lot of times we use anger to mask the fear or to numb or to escape the fear. So emotional addiction is an attempt to maintain balance amidst constantly changing conditions or even chaotic conditions in order to conserve energy and stay safe. So I say safe with quote marks because it's not real safety, it's just familiarity. To your brain, familiarity is safety, even if familiarity is extremely dysfunctional. So as we get older and our circumstances change, our bodies and brains, patterned by neurotransmitters, attempt to constantly bring us back to that same familiar emotional state. So we're looking for situations, we're creating situations, we're responding to situations to constantly bring us back to safety. So the problem with that is that if our nervous system is patterned with fear or shame, that's where our body keeps continually trying to bring us back to keep us safe. So remember that to your brain, I'll say it over and over again, familiarity equals safety. Understanding your emotional addiction helps you determine your starting point when you're trying to come present and come conscious and cultivate self-awareness and rewire your emotional responses. So when we establish your default emotional state, when you identify that, it's possible from there to anticipate faulty assumptions that precipitate self-sabotage behaviors. So what it looks like is this. As I'll use my own self as an example. As a child growing up, I was habituated to fear. Lots and lots of anxiety. I grew up in a chaotic home. My parents were fighting. My dad was very, very angry. And I was, as a small child, I was afraid constantly of everything. And that anxiety carried forward into my life. Now, in the Rise to Reign archetypes, this is the prisoner archetype, just afraid of your own shadow, just fear, 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 fear. And so what we do as we reach for empowerment is we kind of climb up the archetypes through slave, which is characterized by blame, and martyrdom to princess or prince. And that is characterized by like a false sense of power. And so how we accomplish that false sense of power is through anger. So that's what I was talking about when I say that anger is a sort of secondary to fear. If you are a very angry person, dollars to donuts, you're masking anxiety with anger. So I got to that point in my mid-20s probably, and then really got very angry, and not necessarily outwardly angry, but inside just seethingly angry. And sometimes it would trigger, and then I would explode in rage. So when we're talking about emotional equilibrium or emotional addiction, we want to look at the sum of your experiences, not just that one bad thing that happened. You know, we all have maybe that big trauma. Our parents got divorced, or somebody died, or, you know, maybe we were abused, or we witnessed something. And those are definitely impactful, but that's not really what programs our computer. It's really the sum of your experiences from early childhood. It's not the dramatic moments. It's basically like the soup or the environment that you were habituated to as a child. So the way that it's patterned in childhood, I'm going to give you just a quick timeline and then some exercises that you can do for self-reflection. So there's a source stimulus from ages 0 to 3, and this is repetitive or adverse traumatic experiences occur. Like maybe your parents don't, change your diaper quickly or even at all. Maybe you're left in your crib to cry. And then a common emotional response is established to that repetitive stimulus. And then in ages 4 to 7, you establish a protective response to that. So what a protective response is a behavior that is based on faulty perception to protect yourself and minimize suffering. And so that's your adaptation. And I'm going to give you examples in just a minute. And then from ages 8 to 15 is a stage called resignation. And this is basically giving up when your best efforts fail to prevent pain. And this is where, from ages like 8 to 15, this is where your emotional addiction is really solidified and established. Okay, so what does this look like? So I'll give you that example from my own life. So ages 0 to 3, the source stimulus was chaos in my home. My mom and dad were constantly fighting, slamming doors, yelling at each other. My mom would leave in the middle of the night and take us with her, and we wouldn't know we were going to sleep. And it was just constant fear. My emotional response was established ages 0 to 3, although I don't remember. I know as a psychologist, I can look back and see this process play out. Was established in fear. So the protective response is that I tried to behave really well. I tried to shrink and make sure that I didn't cause any and didn't add to the chaos. Try to make sure everybody was happy and calm. And then that's based on the faulty belief that every child has in a chaotic home, is that they're somehow to blame, that it's somehow their fault that their parents are fighting. And if they could just be better, then their parents would get along. Not true. Faulty response. So the emotional response then is adapted from fear to shame. Okay, so that's ages 4 to 7. It's like, what's wrong with me? Shame is what's wrong with me. That's basically the verbal representation of shame. Okay, so ages 8 to 15 is resignation. So despite my best efforts to behave and be small and quiet and make people happy, and your parents still fought. My parents still fought. They actually even got divorced. And so at that point, I realized that my best efforts to prevent pain failed, and I just basically checked out. I pushed everyone away. I got into full rebellion and risky behavior. And so that was my response. So the emotional equilibrium at that point is established as anger. So it started as fear, it went to shame, and it is established in anger. So anger is where I would default most of the time. So in order to repattern an emotional addiction, you have to repattern the fear and the shame, and the anger sort of takes care of itself. All right, so here's your exercise. To establish your own emotional equilibrium from age 0 to 3, what was your home like? What was the source stimulus? And what was the emotional response established? And then age 4 to 7, your protective response, that's your adaptation. Remember, mine went from fear to shame. What's wrong with me? And then what was your age to 8 to 15 is the resignation. So what is established? And spoiler alert, it's where you hang out the most. When you get triggered, where do you go? Do you go to blame? Do you go to self-pity? Do you go to anger? Do you go to catastrophizing and immediately, fear, worry thoughts? Where do you go when you get triggered? The last one's the easiest one because that's where you live now. So what I want you to really do is try to go back to your childhood and figure out how you got there. So ages 0 to 3 is the source, ages 4 to 7 is the adaptation, and ages 8 to 15 is the establishment. All right, my friends, that is a quick primer on emotional addiction. And obviously, if you want to go deep in these concepts and work directly with me, then you can go to risetoromaine.com/enroll. We're enrolling now, and we will be for a short period of time. So we welcome you to check that out. If you have questions for me, you can text your questions to me directly at 843-279-5738, and I will either answer you directly or I'll use your question for an upcoming podcast. All right, my friends, thank you so much for listening. I'll see you in the next episode.